to show you what we prepare. Let's get right on to it. We think that except for a few naturals, everyone hates negotiation at first. Your hands start sweating, your fight or flight instincts kicks in, and your thoughts start spinning like crazy. But it's really going to be as bad as you fear. Most likely it's not. In this session, Rick and I want to show you why you don't necessarily need to have the skills of this guy, Harvey Specter, but can come a long way with a few tips and tricks. Knowing how to negotiate is an important skill. And let me try to illustrate that with a completely different story from 1912. Back then, former President Theodore Roosevelt was campaigning for his third term. It was already a very tough campaign, with many challenges for the former president and his staff, but it was just about to get worse. You see, 3 million copies of Roosevelt's picture, this photograph, had already been printed to be circulated with a campaign speech. But that was just a tiny, tiny problem. The campaign staff had not asked the photographer for permission to use Roosevelt's photograph. And the copyright law at that time allowed the photographer to demand as much as $1 per copy of the photograph. So losing what would be $3 million in 1912 was a pretty bad situation. 3 million would be the equivalent of 60 million today. So you can understand that the campaign manager was in a bit of a jam. But this was what he did. He carefully analyzed the situation, he considered his options, and then went on to send a telegram to the photographer saying this: planning to distribute 3 million copies of campaign speech with photographs. Excellent publicity opportunity for photographers. How much are you willing to pay to use your photographs? Respond immediately. The photographer did not take long to issue a reply with the following message: appreciate opportunity, but can only afford to pay $250. So that went well, pretty well.
And then the third thing Roosevelt was obviously known for was speak softly and carry a big stick, which is a good negotiation advice. Actually, the full quote, according to some probably doubtful internet site, was speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far. Anyway, so this is how Tice and I met. I thought we'd share with you how we ended up doing this. So that building on the left was Tice's office building, and that was the view out his window. And I was on my way to Oslo for a meeting, and I'd heard about this program called Consortia Manager, and Skelk, I'm the executive director of Skelk, I should have said that, had developed its own business system many years ago, probably 12 or 13 years prior to Consortia Manager ever even being thought of, perhaps. So I said to Tice, oh, I hear you have this interesting new program. We have one. Let's compare. And I went to his office, and we looked at them together, and really had no intention at the time of negotiating a deal to change our system at Skelk. But in finding common ground and mutual interests, our meeting led to lasting and ongoing business relationship that has been beneficial to both parties. So basically what we discovered, as you'll see in our talk, is we discovered common ground and common interests, and that led to working together. So, yes?
You do have the board. It's been changed. Okay?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry. No, it's fine. So this is the view of Skelk from the rooftop of our building in downtown LA. Let me go to the next slide. And my focus in this talk, because we're coming at this in a different way, is consortial approach to negotiation, because that's what Skelk spends a lot of time doing. Skelk probably handles 2,500 different products, 100 different vendors, and millions of dollars of contracts in offers for various electronic resources. So negotiation is kind of our middle name. We do it all the time. because we're primarily an opt-in licensing consortium. So one of the things that we stated right up front was this kind of a value that Skelk has, which is that we deal with vendors honestly, fairly, and with an openness to understanding their position. And we also put together a bunch of events, the most peculiar being this Vendors versus Librarians bowling tournament. And the goal behind that was to open doors to building new relationships, because if you do that, then when you actually sit down and negotiate, which they will often do the next day at the vendor day, they already have some common ground from which to start. And then there's, of course, interconsortial relations and so forth. So I look at this from a consortium perspective and a library perspective as well, whereas Tice is looking at it from a vendor perspective. So be nice to him, even though he's a vendor.
All right, but let's get back to negotiations. And when talking about that, then what is it that all good negotiations starts with? That is, of course, preparation. And by far, the most common and costly mistakes in negotiation takes place actually before the talks even begin. And interestingly, it's not even faulty preparation, but it's a lack of preparation altogether. Sometimes under the false belief that negotiations is all art and no science, most people, they will simply fail to prepare enough before starting. And then when coupled with the idea that the real action begins at the bargaining table, well, even really smart people will walk into a big and important negotiation ill-prepared.
Excuse me. Choking on your words. Sorry. A key to this is planning. So you have to envision from the start what you think would be a successful agreement. What would it look like? Sorry, excuse me. And then you work backwards from that point. So it's kind of like visioning. You envision what the end result should look like if it's successful, and then work backwards. What issues do you need to get resolved to get there? And what would the other side need in order to get to that goal as well? You can pursue your interests, but be open to different solutions that meet those interests.
And then when doing that preparation, but also starting the negotiation, we think that having a mindset of discovery is very important. Your goal should be to outset in the beginning to extract and observe as much information as possible. Too often people find it easier just to stick with what they already know or believe. So one easy thing to do at this stage in the negotiation process is to simply build a list of all the things you need to investigate during the negotiation process. A little later in this presentation, we're going to show you an example of that. And then when the actual negotiation starts, there are a few key things that's good to know. The first one is the concept of 7 pieces of information. This is from George A. Miller, who published a well-known research article back in 1956. And he proclaimed at that time that we can only process 7 pieces of information in our conscious mind. In other words, we're easily overwhelmed. I think today that's even more true, because we all have this little mini computer who require all of our attention all the time. So those who view negotiation as a battle of argument, it's in your head that you're being overwhelmed, because when you're not talking, and they are talking, you are already preparing what you're going to say as your next arguments. And that actually leads to this kind of situation, where imagine that's actually what's going on in both of us sitting across the table as counterparts. We all have these thoughts and ideas, and it's almost like a state of schizophrenia going on. So what you instead should try to do is to make the other person your sole focus and include everything what they say. And we have a slide here explaining a little bit more about that.
Right, so one of the ways to clear your head chemically in your head, probably that too, is to listen. So you have to practice listening. And what Tice just said is really important, because I have this problem when I'm in a negotiation, is exactly you start thinking about what your response is and you're not listening anymore. And then you lose track of what they say, and then you might make a faux pas. So listening is very important. You try to make it about both parties' interests. So in other words, you do want to, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about how do you establish a rapport with the people that you're working with on a negotiation, but it's probably more important to focus on the interests and separate those interests from the people themselves. Because sometimes you might like them and sometimes you might not. So you don't want to get bogged down in the relationship aspect of it and lose sight of the interest that you're there for. You may want to validate the other party's emotions or goals, and you want to ultimately work on creating trust between all parties.
Yeah. Then when the actual negotiation starts, there's an idea that it's actually okay to start with no. This is something that's been framed by an author called Jim Camp in his book with the same name. And the idea is basically that you've been conditioned to fear the word no. But what we should do instead is to consider no as the start of the negotiation and not the end. Because it seldom really means that the other part has, when saying no, considered all aspects of the offer or of the situation, or all the facts. No is often a decision, and it's often temporary to maintain status quo. And the reason is simple, because change is scary for most of us. And no, that can help you provide that little bit of protection from that scariness. I personally use that in a lot of my negotiations and sales processes, because as a salesperson, it's very clear. I'm very clear when I present our EM tool, all the things we cannot do. So I actually start by discovering all the areas where we say we cannot do this, and we can do this with access, and we cannot do this with discovery, and all of the things we cannot do, and try to figure out, is this a showstopper already in the beginning, because I'm going to save a huge amount of time, and more importantly, it's also going to be more honest. So when it comes down to that we actually get an implementation, you know exactly what you're getting from me. I know that if any of my sales trainers would hear me say this, they will probably get a heart attack, because I've been trained a lot as a salesperson, and it's really all about starting with getting that little tiny yes, and then getting the next yes, and the next yes, and then finally you get that yes, which is the signature on the contract. But I think at least they're an alternative to that. This guy, Jim Camp, also advised in his book that when you give your counterpart the permission to say no from the beginning, you're giving them more control. He calls it the right to veto. And it's basically because that when you do that, you preserve their right to say no, and they will feel more comfortable from the start. And again, people like to be in control.
But it's important to note that while both parties might start with no, they can move to yes by practicing the tools in this book. I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with this book. It's at least for me, the best book I've read on negotiation. It's been around a long time and it's been updated. But the main points that I think this book makes are that you need to separate the people from the problem, as I pointed out before, because you do have a mutual thing that you're working on together, and to recognize that the other party is your partner in problem solving. You want to focus again on the interests and not the people. Don't get bogged down in opposing positions. Identify your mutual interests. Get into their shoes to better understand their needs. And that's a really important one, is try to imagine that you're the other party, and what is it that they're really seeking, and what is it that you can do to get there. That's an important point to keep in mind, so that you're therefore creating options for mutual gain.
Yeah. When we're talking about yes, because of course that's what we are aiming for, you should know that there are three kinds of yes. The first one is what we call the counterfeit yes. And in this one, the counterpart plans on saying no, but either feels yes is just an easier escape route, or just want to keep the conversation going to maybe obtain more information. And that's the confirmation no, yes. And most times that's just what you could call an innocent yes, or a reflexive response to a black and white question. So in general, it's just an affirmation, but there's no promise of action behind this yes. The thing is that both with the counterfeit and the confirmation yes, you need to be careful. You might see vendors saying yes to something that is of less importance for that specific sales rep, like, providing the title list or providing correct user stats at the right time. They can easily give you an yes, because that's not what they're measured on. They're measured on something completely else, because these things doesn't cost you anything. So be careful with these and make sure to pay attention to them. What you're aiming for is this, the commitment yes. That's the real deal. It is that, it's that kind of commitment saying that we are going to do this, and this is actually, this is the plan. Difficult part is, of course, to identify and get to the commitment yes. What you can do during a negotiation process to test both what kind of yes it is, but also to see what kind of commitment you see from your vendor, is to give them small assignments or tasks during the sales process, whether that's getting you a follow-up email or a reference list. Are they actually delivering on that? All right, then let's move on to something a bit different that also can be used as part of getting to these yes and get the mutual understanding.
Yeah. So mirroring. So mirroring is one technique that's important. It helps you pay attention to and match the other person's body language, modes of communication, and more. So these photos of Barack Obama are an illustration of this phenomenon. If you look at them, you see how he's often mirroring the person with whom he's speaking or negotiating in many instances. Effective leaders have the ability to build rapport with both friends and enemies. And it's often an unconscious behavior, but it's a sign that people are bonding, they're in sync. It's a sign that you're establishing rapport. It's a phenomenon that follows, I would just say that mirroring is the same as sending a signal that says, trust me, you and I, we are thinking alike, or we have a common problem to solve, let's figure out how to work together. And that's where you make the connection. Go ahead to the next slide. Right, so mirroring can be done with these different methods: speech patterns, body language, vocabulary, tempo, pacing, tone of voice. And many of you are probably aware of this, even if you're not consciously paying attention. So for example, somebody folds their arms. You might fold your arms a few minutes later, but you're not consciously doing it. There's also something that sounds ominous, but actually teaches a lot of this, called neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP. And what neuro-linguistic programming does is it focuses on verbal cues and visual cues to establish rapport between people. And these cues could be things such as eye movement, like certain eye movements will indicate whether somebody's primary mode is visual or kinesthetic or auditory. And then if you pick up on that, you can change the vocabulary that you're using in order to say things like, well, I hear what you say, but they're actually visual, and you say, I hear what they say, it might go right past them. So you look for these kinds of cues, because I keep going back to establishing rapport, because that's kind of what you're looking to do here, is you're looking to get to that common goal, and once that rapport is established, it's much easier to do so. So these are all forms of mirroring that are good skills to practice if you're not, and many of you might be just doing this unconsciously anyway, but if you're not, it's kind of an interesting thing to mess around with. So, can they read or do you want to read what David Brooks said there, since it's small?
Is it small? Almost every successful person begins with two beliefs: the future can be better than the present, and I have the power to make it so.
So what are the sources of power in a negotiation? One is knowing the people, like who are the vendors, decision makers. What are their interests? What are their options? What objective criteria do you think exist to govern your negotiation? One of the things I recommend if you're going into a negotiation with the vendor is try to be aware of what the current financial situation of that vendor is. And because there are examples, and I gave this example in a talk yesterday. There was a vendor once who came to Skelk who we had an ongoing relationship with, and every year was a 5% increase, fairly standard, and then one year it was 32%. And we go, well, 32%, that's crazy. We're not going to do that. And they said, well, the lowest we can go is 25%. And we said, okay, but you're going to lose the business. And they said, no, that's our final offer. We did it, and the libraries all canceled. And then they came back to us, and they said, oh, we're sorry, we'll do 5%. And we go, well, sorry, it's too late. Well, the background to this was that the company was putting itself up for sale, and they wanted to show a lot of cash on the books. And so if you know that, and you know what they're up to, then you know why they're going to be insistent, because they're trying to improve their market position to get a better sale. So these are the kinds of things that, I know a lot of librarians tend to feel like, oh, I don't want to know about business. I don't want to get my hands dirty. One of the reasons I became a librarian is because I'm idealistic and I want to help people, and I don't want to get involved in that dirty corporate world. But it's not like buying books in 1980 anymore, folks. You're licensing stuff from big corporations, and you've got to work on understanding where they're coming from and what they're up to, because they're often in the position of power unless you know enough to be able to counter that power with power of your own. The other things that you might want to do is be aware of the structure, the internal structure of the company, because if you're dealing with a sales rep and the sales rep doesn't have the power that you need in order to make a decision and move the negotiation forward, ask for the next person up or the next person up. Go all the way up, as high as you can get. You have the power of making a commitment, what you will do and you won't do, clarifying what commitments you expect from them. A concrete offer also, if you make a concrete offer, it can be very persuasive, because the consequences of no agreement are not palatable to your negotiating partner. So it may be important for example, for the vendor to have you as a customer. So for example, Skelk represents hundreds of libraries potentially. So for them, we have some leverage because there's a lot of business to be had. And finally, having built a working relationship and having defined common interests, you're going to have a recipe for success. And one of the things that we have noticed with Skelk is that we've developed these ongoing relationships over the last 20 years. And those relationships, there's now a basis. So a negotiation is nowhere near as difficult now, most of the time, as they were 15, 20 years ago. Although, if those of you who are old enough like me could remember back in the day when this was all new, you could actually wrangle even better deals, because often the vendors didn't know exactly what they were doing either. And so you could ask for the moon and they'd give it to you. But those days are pretty much over. So some other little bit of advice: practice a lot, find a mentor, always have humor. I've always found that humor is a crucial ingredient. You have to remember that what you're negotiating is probably not the same level of weightiness as the Iran nuclear deal, for example. You're trying to negotiate a deal to get access to information for your library and for your clientele. Also, use data. It's always good to be able to back it up. And they often have the data, and if you don't, you want to make sure you have some data as well. And look for opportunities to negotiate in everyday life. They're everywhere, and so you can practice this very easily. So this is an example of, and I think vendors have heard this ad nauseum, to be honest, but this is an example of data. So most of you have probably been here. Your library budget keeps shrinking, but the costs of the content keep going up and up and up. And so you don't have enough funds and you have to threaten to cancel, but often the content's so important to you that you don't cancel and you just kind of eat it and you keep subscribing or purchasing or whatever. So what you want to do, again, is do your homework, aim high, try to meet in the middle. It's very common in negotiations that everybody gets 70% of what they want. You're not going to get everything you want, but neither are they. But that area in the middle is where you're going to find success. The other aspect of this, I mean, this is an example of making the most of a budget crisis, but clearly, since this is something that has been going on as long as I've been a librarian, this is nothing new. So one of the things that you can do with a budget crisis kind of a situation is instead come up with, some creative approaches to how they price the content, where maybe you can, for example, with an ebook vendor, we once proposed, we have a lot of small libraries in Skelk. So if you combine 3 of those libraries and treat them as one entity, we can subdivide the cost so that all those libraries could afford it, whereas they couldn't afford it at the price that they would charge each library. And so we come up with a creative model where they get the business, because you always have to remind them the basic tenet, which is, do you want some money or no money? And if you can give them some money, it's better than nothing. And most of them will respond to that. So other things besides a budget crisis to think about are obviously license term negotiations. That's the flip side of this. We weren't going to spend a lot of time, I think, on that, but I think a lot of you know about this from other sessions that have been offered. And then finally, if you have an ERM or a system such as what Tice has developed, that gives you data to bolster your negotiation. And so Tice is now going to give you some really good examples of that.
Yeah. So basically with the key concepts that we just covered, we wanted to switch now on the data and the insight you need in order to have the best possible negotiations. Like Rick said, as a disclaimer, that we actually built this, so of course we're a bit colored by that fact. So basically what you are looking for are data, it's insights, and it's decision support. You need the data to provide the insights, and the insights will then help you to negotiate, and eventually, because that's not always what it should be, an agreement, but maybe it end up with an agreement. But the thing is that typically ERMs, they focus just on the left side of this slide, what we call the cost readership. That is the licenses, that is the subscriptions you are buying. And you look, for instance, at cost per use. But that's still only cost. It's not what we call return on investment. So to understand the return, we can not only look at the input, we also need to look at the results from buying this content, and hence also the consequences of either renewing or canceling. And that again would be the little university in the middle, and then all the research output in terms of articles produced by what you buy in the library. And when we earlier talked about preparation, then here's a list of some of the things that we suggest you use when doing negotiation. All of this in order to provide you the best angle in the negotiation and insight. And remember, this is important to get this before you actually start the negotiation. And hopefully your M tool should help you to answer most, if not all, of these questions. So if we're talking about concretely, how are we doing this? Well, first of all, there's the user stats part. We all know that. We all look into that, and that's very much interesting. And combined with the pricing that you pay for your resources, you can get a cost per use, which is all good and fine. And especially if you compare it, so you see trends over years, then you start to see something that actually provides you some value. But like I said before, there's a bit more to it, because you could also look at how much you publish in a given journal. And with that also understand their OA policies and potential APC cost. So you're being asked to subscribe while your orders or your researchers at the same institutions are asked to pay to publish, and all that money is either directly or indirectly from your institution. And that is some of the things that is interesting to you to get an insight in. Rick mentioned license term. We haven't really touched on it here, but that's something that's also important to include in negotiation, as well as, like I mentioned, the APC cost. And why? Yeah, this is getting more and more important. I know this is from a European universities. This is all the Dutch universities, where they now are at a point where 50% of all the articles in 2017 are open access. Whether it's green or gold, it doesn't say. But with all the things coming, especially in Europe with Coalition S and so forth, this will just increase. And the thing is that if it's open access, do you then need to pay for it? Of course not. So it should be part of your negotiation. So what you can try to do is to gather all this data for the resources in one place. And see where the packages and even the individual titles can be evaluated. And when you do so, I know it's probably very small for most of you, but you will see some very interesting results. So this example, for instance, I've highlighted here. You got two different titles down here, two different journals. So one is a little less expensive than the one in the bottom. And if you look at that, you would say, okay, looking at both JR1 and at JR5, I would actually say that I got most value for money for the expensive one at the bottom. But what if you look at the references? So the references being how much have our researchers used this journal for the articles that they produced in a given year. And in the top one, you see there's 14 references, whereas in the bottom one, there's 0, meaning that it might be there's a bigger readership on the one journal in the bottom, but the other one is actually used a lot more, giving you an opportunity to include that in your negotiations. Another thing you can do is to consider alternatives. So what if you were about to break up a big deal, for instance? What would that look like? Or whatever journal package you're about to buy. So without really knowing your ultimate fallback plan, I think it's difficult to really dig into the negotiation. So this is what this example shows, that the choices you made of journals here will provide you 65% of the usage that you had last year compared to the big package at the same cost. So obviously this is a bad deal to cut the big deal in this example. And oftentimes when we do these analyses, that's also in all honesty, that's normally what we see, that it's very difficult to cut away the big deal without it hurts in terms of your user stats. And what we are then wanting to aim at is to get this, we termed it the total financial engagement. And the total financial engagement is really to look at, not only to look at the subscription fees as you see in the top, but also to include what are the APC costs. That will give you the total financial engagement. Then, depending on the deal you're doing with the vendor, like in this case, there's some discounts as you see, so you might get a better deal. But what you're aiming for is really try to get all the data out and to prepare you for these and really saying, no, publisher, we're not buying for 2.3 million from you. We're actually buying from 2.6 million in this case. All of that, and with the increase of open access, is going to be more and more important. And where we're ending is in this picture. So this is from our system where we present this for the decision maker. So all the things you just show, that's more like insights. And for people who know how to understand it, this is then more a quick view of that, where you can see in the bottom left corner the price increase per year. You can see the downloads, but you can also see, how important is this in terms of how much do we publish in these journals. How many of these are OA, and how many are references, all to give you that when you're actually making the decision. I know there's a bit more to it than just saying order and then that's it. But basically, the insight, I think that's the key takeaway from this. Yes. And with that, I think we want to wrap up with this little quote from Kenny Rogers, and then see if any one of you have any questions, anything of this we should take a closer look at. Feel free to ask your questions.
How many, maybe go to the next slide. Just, we could throw this out as a question, perhaps. How many of you had nasty negotiations with a vendor? Aha. Okay. Do you generally feel frustrated by these, or have you had successful negotiations as a result? Anybody? Don't be shy. Even with the same vendor. Are there techniques you've developed to deal with this?
Well, the really nasty one
Was
was part of
what?
the worst one was part of a group, the consortial negotiation, not just me.
Yeah.
So it was not just me that they did.
Oh yeah, we didn't talk about that, but when you're doing it in a team, then you got to work with the team ahead of time and make sure everybody knows their proper role and responsibility so you don't step on each other. And then when that happens, the other party has the advantage. They take your stick away.
We got a question here?
Anybody else? You're going to use the mic? Thank you.
You're
I
talking
should
about
have asked people to do that because I can't.
in university at the National Research Council in Canada. I had an interesting situation with one vendor just last year. They were UK based, and we were license negotiations. It was a brand new license that they pulled out after we had paid, months later. And they said, basically, I made changes to it because there were things that we just couldn't accept. I sent it in, and they were like, okay, we'll look at it. And I guess that was like kind of the counterfeit yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So anyways, what happened was that they came back and they said, no, we're not going to make any changes to our agreement, take it or leave it. So we had no choice but to walk away, and we couldn't at first get the product anywhere else. And then we found an alternative. But the thing was, though, is that I always kept the lines of communication, like whenever they allow it, like because they come back and say, well, do you want to rethink about that? And I'd be like, well, anytime you're ready to negotiate, yes, we're here.
Yeah,
We're
exactly.
listening. And then, they kept coming back. I guess they must have been having problems with other clients as well. So anyway, so the way we left it was they were like, let's talk about it. But yeah, they just kind of come back and forth, but I don't know if we'll ever reach anything with them.
That's a great example.
But we kept
Yeah.
I was always like, look, I'm willing to talk whenever you are. So that's one tip.
Yeah, that's a very helpful example.
Thank you for that.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I was involved in a bit of a contentious price negotiation with a I wouldn't say a large vendor, but it was a significant chunk of our budget. And it felt to me at the time like kind of talking to a wall. You spoke earlier about listening. In this particular case, I felt like I was in the position of not being listened to. No matter how I tried to present the information to my counterpart, the answer always came back the same, right? And I would try to move to different positions, but the answer would always come back the same. So he wasn't moving his position, and so this became frustrating. I mean, eventually we just re-upped for a year, and kind of went back and regrouped and kind of said, you know, what can we change to present more positions in the subsequent year? And the negotiation started out very much the same. So I'm kind of building off what you said. I just brought in more people from different perspectives within the organization to keep presenting at, and just dragged it out until kind of the message finally got through and we got the better deal. But it definitely took some hammering to kind of get him tuned into our position.
Was there any opportunity to go to somebody else in the company since that person was intransigent?
So, I mean, we did kind of, that was one of our strategies both times, was to, can we move it up the chain? And the first time, just we didn't have much success with that. But the second time, we were more insistent. And eventually, we kind of pulled multiple people on their end into a phone call so that, you know, we weren't speaking with just the rep that we kind of felt like we were hitting a roadblock with. So that was probably helpful. Yes.
They were clearly well trained to be intransigent, apparently.
Oh yeah, I think he knew what he was doing.
Oh yeah, yeah. There was a strategy there.
All right. If you have any kind of other questions or feedback or want to talk more about this, feel free to reach out to either Rick or I, and we'll be happy to get back to you. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you very much.